Hi everybody, it's Camille. I wanted to answer a question for you today about how conjugated bilirubin enters the blood. So to start out with, let's review what is bilirubin. And hopefully in your mind you came up with the idea that it is a breakdown product of what you see here. And if you need a little reminder, what you see in front of you here is hemoglobin. And the little small green sections right here are heme. And bilirubin is a byproduct of heme breakdown. So the next little quiz is which of the organs shown in this picture here break down erythrocytes, which of course contain hemoglobin and thus heme. And ideally you have answered that it was the spleen, as you can barely see it here, but the spleen is what breaks down old erythrocytes and releases bilirubin into the blood. Now, in the blood, when the spleen breaks down these heme products, or these heme molecules, the bilirubin is not water soluble. It actually tends to bind to albumin, which is a plasma protein, and it can't be excreted via the kidneys. So instead, what happens is it gets conjugated in the liver by hepatocytes. So bilirubin plus glucuronic acid equals conjugated bilirubin. And there's actually a number of different variants, so this is not one single molecule. And there's a specific enzyme that facilitates this process. But this is all happening in the hepatocytes of the liver. And so once the liver gets its hands on bilirubin and conjugates it, this conjugated molecule is water soluble, which is excellent. That means we can excrete it. Typically, the conjugated bilirubin is going to go into the bile from the hepatocytes, and then, of course, we excrete it via the feces. Now, to add another layer of detail here, this is a chart that I have drawn myself, so forgive the primitive nature. Graphics are not my thing. So this is kind of a getting into the nitty-gritty of the liver, but we see here these the light blue rectangles are meant to be hepatocytes, which are the cells, of course, the functional cells of the liver. And then we have our bloodstream, our blood flowing through up here. And then the bile, you can see each of the hepatocytes has a direct connection on what we call the apical surface to the bile. And connecting the hepatocytes together are tight junctions, which don't actually, not surprisingly, look like what's right here. They're essentially proteins that link the two hepatocytes together, which prevents bile from flowing back up into the interstitial space. Okay, so these tight junctions are basically welding the two hepatocytes together. And of course, there would be more tight junctions here and so forth between all of the hepatocytes on the apical surface. So what this means is that if anything wants to travel from the hepatocyte into the bile, it needs to go through this apical membrane. And it turns out that in the case of conjugated bilirubin, there is a specific protein that assists in that process called MRP2, which also stands for multi-drug resistant protein 2, sometimes also known as MOAT, which is not a concern here. But so this particular protein helps move conjugated bilirubin into the bile. And then, of course, the bile can then, it converges with other channels of bile from elsewhere in the liver and ultimately winds its way into the bile duct and is stored in the gallbladder before secretion. So this is normally how conjugated bile exits the body, and there's a very small percentage of it in the blood, extremely small, but for the most part in a healthy person you're not going to have a lot of conjugated bilirubin in the blood. You might have unconjugated bilirubin in the blood, but typically it's just on its way to the liver where it will then get conjugated and excreted. So the next question is, what happens when bile flow is obstructed? Because normally that conjugated bilirubin would be in the bile and excreted that way. But if the bile gets backed up for whatever reason, then what happens? So just as a review, this is another picture here. But typically, so here are our hepatocytes, right? And the bile is gathering here. It goes out through the ductules, joins with other ductules, and ultimately forms a large duct. Conversely, the blood, we have some blood coming in from the gastrointestinal tract or elsewhere, joined with blood from the hepatic arterioles coming from the heart. That's joining together on the other side. So we have our bloodstream here, our hepatocytes here, and our bile here. So if bile gets obstructed, what that means is there isn't a good way to move that conjugated bilirubin out of the body. And what typically happens if bile flow gets obstructed is we see conjugated bilirubin levels in the blood rise. So the question is, how is the bilirubin getting from this hepatocyte back into the bloodstream, right? Because we've got this little interstitial space here, and then it somehow has to get back um, into this into the blood. So what exactly is going on there? Well, it turns out there's two possible options. One option is that this bile, the pressure, when the pressure increases so much that it essentially busts through this tight junction here, and then basically works its way into the interstitial space and back into the blood. The bloodstream, actually, the capillaries here are fenestrated. They have lots of they're called sinusoidal, so it's very easy, relatively easy for things that are in the interstitial space to just get back into the bloodstream. It's not, this is not a typical capillary where it might be more difficult for substances to return into the capillary. But first, the bile acids would have to bust through this tight junction. So it's possible that when the pressure gets so high that does happen. But there is a particular disease that some people have, which is called dubin-jonhson syndrome, and it's basically a problem with this MRP2 protein, meaning they can't get this the conjugated bilirubin into the bile. So there's no increased pressure here, but the people who have this disease do have high conjugated bilirubin levels in their blood. So in this case, in their case, it's definitely not pressure getting it there. So there must be some other route for the conjugated bilirubin to enter the blood. And conveniently enough, there's another protein called MRP3, which is found on the basolateral side of the hepatocytes. And it basically does the same thing. It helps conjugated bilirubin get out of the hepatocyte, except in this case, instead of going into the bile, it's going into the interstitial space, and from there it can just go back, diffuse into the bloodstream. So, in some people, potentially when the bile flow is blocked, that may downregulate expression of MRP2 and upregulate MRP3, or some people may have a genetic issue with this protein, and therefore, in order for the hepatocytes to get rid of this conjugated bilirubin, they may be doing it via the MRP3. So that's another kind of exciting mechanism for this conjugated bilirubin to enter into the blood. And of course, they've done some lab tests actually on animals, in animal models, where they found that they block this particular protein in animals who have this dubin-jonhson syndrome, which is what inhibits the action of this MRP2, that in those folks, then they will have lower conjugated bilirubin levels in the blood. So that does seem to be at least one potential mechanism. All right, so hopefully that answers your questions. This was, there was a couple of interesting sources that I checked out for this video, and I will put them in the blog post. If you want to check them out yourself, feel free to do that, and let me know if you have any questions, okay?